This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Emerson Mini CQC-15. I'm going to try to give you a very informative, sort of comprehensive overview of this knife, what I think about it, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are. We go through these reviews in 3 sections. First, some specifications. Then we go through the knife sort of tip to tail, look at the features, look at what works about it, what doesn't work about it, just how it's put together. And then finally we go through and score it across a 10-point scale to help compare it to other knives and just give a sense for what I think about it overall. Let's get to it. Starting with some specifications here, the Emerson CQC-15 is a USA-made knife, as all Emersons are. Retails for $217. And even though this is called the Mini CQC-15, it is not exactly a mini knife. And we'll go through the size comparisons. The default CQC-15 is a very large knife. This is still what most people consider a full-size knife. It's just small compared to the main CQC-15. This blade is 3.5 inches long. Like almost all Emersons, is 125 thousandths thick on the blade stock. Steel is 154 cm, not even CPM 154, it is 154 cm, which again is typical for Emerson. Emerson makes a few knives in S35 yen. They have started to make a couple in Magnet Cut, but virtually all of them are 154 cm. This knife is 7.9 inches overall, weighs 4.5 ounces, and again, like virtually all Emersons, probably about 90% of them, it is on nylitron washers. They're sort of oil-impregnated washers. Let's get some size comparisons here, because again, even though this is called the Mini CQC-15, it's not exactly mini. Actually, let's start off with the sort of most important and direct size comparison. Here it is against the full-size CQC-15. And you can see, while it is significantly smaller in both the blade and the handle, the CQC-15 is a very large knife for anybody who has handled one. And they didn't shrink it down like crazy for this one. They took basically a little less than half an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch off the blade, probably about the same off the handle, and it's still a relatively large knife. The CQC-15 being one of Emerson's larger knives in general. Compare this to an XM18 and you can see the so-called Mini CQC-15 is the same size as a full-sized XM18, at least in terms of blade length and handle length. Very, very similar here. We take our PM2 out. You can see again, very similar in both blade length and handle length to your Paramilitary 2 here. Compare it to a large Sebenza. Again, very similar to that large Sebenza. Let's take a couple smaller knives here, compare it to a Spyderco Delica. Bigger than the Delica in both the blade and the handle. And let's look at that blade stock here. You can see 125 thousandths makes the Delica stock look very, very thin. If you compare it to something like your PM2, you can see the PM2 stock is quite a bit thicker than what you have here on your Mini CQC-15. And Emerson does not change their blade stock on their minis. Same stock thickness as the full size. Here it is compared to your Bug Out. The Bug Out is actually not that much smaller in terms of blade length and handle length, because the Bug Out is, of course, not that much below a full-size knife. It's just a very skinny and light and carryable full-size knife. And then, last but not least, your Benchmade 940. And you can see, even though the length of the blade and handle is very, very similar, it's obviously a much larger package, especially, if you look about when you fold it up here. The CQC-15 is a relatively large object in the pocket for its blade size and handle size, even compared to something like the PM2, which is sort of a very large in the pocket knife for the amount of blade size you get because of that Spyderco hump. The CQC-15 absolutely rivals it in that regard. So, looking at the CQC-15 here, again, the Mini CQC-15, I will probably accidentally refer to it as the 15 throughout the review. So this blade shape here, it is a Tonto recurve. And you can see your recurve down there and your Tonto tip. So this blade shape is a combination of two previous Emerson blade shapes, the Commander, which gives you that recurve, and your CQC-15, which gives you that Tonto tip. And so at the very edge of the blade here, you get that little angled Tonto, and then all here you have that big old recurve, and it is a pretty aggressive recurve. Now, benefits of a recurve: when you cache material here, especially for your pulling cuts and your sort of slicing and dragging cuts, something gets caught in that recurve will slice very, very well. There are two downsides of the recurve. One, it can be a little harder to do some sorts of continuous cuts if you're not making use of that recurve. It's sometimes just a little bit more awkward to find the edge and to get the edge exactly where you want to, if for some reason, like because of, you're trying to cut around something or get into a small space and you can't really use that recurve. It can be sometimes hard to get a cut to really ride on that non-recurved edge. Really, if you're not trying to use the recurve, you've only got that much blade length to deal with. And then obviously a recurve much harder to sharpen than a typical non-recurve blade, because you need either very skinny stones. Sometimes people will use circular rods, things like that. Actually, that's pretty much what you do need to get in that recurve. If you have, say, a large stone passing through it, it won't be able to get into that recurve. If you think about flat stone, it'll just touch sort of 2 points on the recurve, not get the whole length of the recurve, and not actually sharpen it. So the stones that I have make it very difficult to sharpen recurves. It is possible. I use a TS Prof Cadet for all of my sharpening, and it is possible, but a pain in the butt to sharpen recurves, especially a more aggressive recurve like this. Some shallow recurves you can kind of power right through. This one you definitely cannot. Now, the benefits of this hybrid Tonto recurve blade shape: obviously a Tonto like this, first off, as with a lot of Emersons, you get this big fat saber grind here. So you're carrying a lot of that blade stock thickness. Even though 125 thousandths isn't that thick, you're carrying that full thickness all the way out to here. It only starts to taper right at that very tip there. And with this Tonto, you get a very sharp, pointy, stabby tip right there with a lot of weight, a lot of thickness behind that tip. It is very good for stabbing, pointing into things when you want to just pierce into something, whether it's a bag or a wall, or trying to use that tip to sort of drag, pull through stuff. That Tonto tip is very nice, very easy to use. It also just frankly looks cool. And then with this recurve, for what I was saying about the negatives of the recurve, it does cut extraordinarily well. If you say, let's pretend you've got a rope here and you can drag it into that rope, stuff that gets caught here, or if you're cutting through cardboard and you can sort of drag the blade through the cardboard so the stuff gets caught in the recurve, cuts extraordinarily well. And a good recurve is a little bit like serrations, where even if the edge isn't extraordinarily sharp, or even if the geometry isn't that great, it can still feel like it cuts very, very well, very effectively, because of the way that recurve traps the material and sort of separates the material and keeps that material in the cut. And that's good because, as is typical with Emerson's, the geometry on this is not great. 125 thousandths, again, not thick, but you've only got about 1/3 of that blade height to actually drop down to the cutting edge, and it's just not that thin behind the edge. Now, Emerson, let's see, this is probably the best way to see here. Honestly, you can see at the tip. So you see that tip there. If you look closely, you can see only one edge of that is ground. You can see this right edge here. You can see that little sharpened, there we go, that little sharpened edge there. And you can see Emerson's are chisel sharpened. So this is V ground. So you've got a grind here, but it's chisel sharpened. There's no sharpening on this side. There is a sharpened secondary bevel on this side. That has two benefits, and this is usually about a 25-degree edge that they put on this one. The first benefit of a single-sided edge like that is it can feel extremely sharp, especially when you're cutting through, not when you're sort of doing pretend chef knife stuff, like tomatoes, grapes, stuff like that. A chisel edge like this won't necessarily feel all that sharp. But when you're going through slightly rougher material, like if you're trying to cut through some kind of canvas or some kind of rough fabric, or if you're trying to cut through wood, plant material, all that sort of stuff, anything that is rougher or a bit of a toothier, grabbier edge can be helpful. These Emerson chisel edges can feel phenomenally sharp, where at times, even though the geometry objectively is not that good, even though this is relatively fat behind the edge, it can feel like it cuts extraordinarily well. You combine that with the recurve, and when this thing is sharp, it can cut through cardboard and do a lot of around the house tasks that make use of that recurve, as well as anything else in my collection, despite being a kind of chubby blade at that edge. So I really like Emerson's chisel edges here. I find that they lead to some really excellent cutting performance, and I actually wish more brands would use chisel edges like this. And the other benefit is it is easier to sharpen. Now, this blade style, again with a Tonto here and a recurve, is right up there with something like a Grimsmo Norseman in sort of the hardest sorts of blade shapes to sharpen that you're reasonably going to encounter. I certainly, if I were to sharpen this, there's no way I would be able to reasonably preserve this little secondary or this little sort of point here. I would probably end up squishing that out over the course of sharpenings. And again, this recurve is a pain to sharpen, but when you are sharpening, it can be half the work because you are only sharpening one side. And part of the reason that I know that Emerson's sort of perform really, really well with this single secondary bevel is I have had a couple Emersons that I've gotten secondhand that somebody, whoever's gotten them before me, has gone around and has V-sharpened that edge. They put a tip conventional edge on both sides, and when you do that to an Emerson, it cuts terribly. It cuts exactly like you would expect the geometry to. It just loses its cutting performance entirely, and you really see how poorly ground, for lack of a better term, these blades are. Now, Emerson grinds these blades very intentionally that way. They say that it is because they are trying to maintain that toughness. They would rather have a blade that you need to sharpen regularly but won't break on you than a blade that, has exceptional cutting performance but is more fragile. I get that for their intended use case, their intended user. It does make sense. But if you're coming from, even something like a, Hinderer skinny slicer or something like that, not stuff with bad cutting performance, but stuff with good cutting performance, your usual sort of EDC stalwarts, Emersons are not going to cut as well as what you're used to, though you can get screaming sharp edges on them with this chisel edge if you want to, and if you know what you're doing. The other thing just to mention about the blade here is the steel. Now, I don't talk about steel all that much on my channel because I think that the steel snobbery is a little bit overdone. And even though I find knife steels really, really interesting, I think that for most people, the difference between steels is overblown. That's an uncommon belief across the community. But I do think that most people in most use cases with all the super steels we've got today won't be able to tell a major difference between, say, well-heat-treated S45VN and MagnaCut. There are exceptions when you get into those high-performance edge retention steels like your S90Vs, your Maximate, your 15Vs, stuff like that. Then you do see meaningfully different performance, but usually steel is not a huge factor in my knife buying decision, to the extent that I've become quite comfortable these days even with stuff like S30V if it's heat treated well. But this is 145 cm, which is a very old and frankly cheap steel. When you see 145 cm on any knife that isn't an Emerson, you expect that to be a budget knife. Again, this isn't even CPM 154, which is the Carpenter powder metallurgy version of 154 cm, which does have meaningfully better properties. I'm a pretty big fan of CPM 154, but this is 154 cm, which is a mediocre steel in every regard. Its edge retention is definitely worse than what you're used to seeing. Its toughness is fine but not great, and its corrosion resistance is also fine but not great. There's nothing patently wrong about this steel, but you will absolutely notice, particularly with that edge retention, that you will be sharpening your Emersons more often than a lot of other knives if you're used to using lots of modern super steels. It will sharpen very quickly, which is the benefit, and again, that's part of why Emerson says that they choose these steels, is they would rather have a knife that you have to sharpen regularly that sharpens easily. You know, as Emerson people say, you can sharpen it on a rock. But that does mean literally with things like this Mini 15, I will experience something I never experienced with super steels, which is I will carry this knife sort of over the course of a day, and I will feel and experience it dulling over the course of a single day, to the point that if I'm using it not even hard, but just robustly, I will have a dull knife that I need to sharpen at the end of a single day. That is never the problem if I have S45 VN, or let alone stuff like 15V Maximate, things like that. So it is a little frustrating that Emerson continues to use that steel. I know they have their rationale, and I know that, frankly, this $217 knife would be at least a $300 knife, given the way Emerson tends to price things, if they used even S35 VN in here. But I do think this would be more compelling as a $300 knife with S35 VN than as a $217 knife with with 154 CM, because it is frustrating when you've got a utility focused knife like this to literally feel like at the end of the day, like, damn, this thing isn't cutting anymore, even when it cut at the start of the day. So that's my little rant on the steel there. But this blade shape is super useful because of the combination of that Tonto tip and that recurve. Really, really nice in the garden. This is actually one of my favorite knives in the garden. Really easy to get around branches, get around sticks, twigs, things like that. Use that recurve and pull stuff into it, drag stuff in. Cuts through hard material, cuts through soft material really, really well. Again, that recurve is doing a lot of the work, and even if it is dulling, you will still get cutting performance out of that recurve. Similarly for cardboard. You know, when I'm opening boxes, breaking down boxes, things like that, when I can get in there and catch that recurve and drag it through, it works really, really well. And then this Tonto tip, having that fore piercing and having it sort of align just a little bit above the pivot, which is a really natural place to have it, it's just a blade shape that works really well. And then it's augmented by the fact that this is one of Emerson's very best handles from a feel perspective. Typical Emerson handle in terms of construction, you know, you got a slab of G10 with an aggressive peel ply texture on there. You got their awesome jimping on the back here, big thick jimps that give you some extra traction when you want it. When you press in there, they will definitely hold you in place. But because they're not that sharp, you can just run your finger past them and they're not abrasive at all. A little bit of jimping here at the lock bar access. This is a liner lock. A little bit of jimping back here, and that's it. Now, very simple construction. I believe they're still running a steel liner on this side, a titanium liner on the lock side. Barrel spacers on your back here. Everything is in modern Emerson's fit and finished very nicely. It's a very simple Spartan design, but it fits together very well. But the ergonomics on this handle, when you get all four fingers in here, are exceptional. This is one of the ergonomically best handles that, honestly, that I am aware of on the entire market. Your thumb right here sits nicely on that ramp. This is the only grip, really. I mean, you can do some pinch grip stuff like that. It feels a little awkward. But this grip here, where you got this big fat front guard holding that front finger in place, you got a nice belly here for your second and third fingers. You got some jimping here for your pinky. This rolls right into your palm. This grip is super, super secure. There are very few knives that feel more locked into my hand than this mini CQC-15. You know, the full-size CQC-15 is definitely made for people with larger hands. I've got so much space on this handle that doesn't feel quite as locked in. This, for my large glove-sized hands, which means that for a dude, I've got relatively small hands, my hands lock right into this handle, right between the two anchor points here, and you could hit this knife, hit the blade with a baseball bat, and it wouldn't whack it, and it would not be moving out of my hand. And frankly, that is very confidence inspiring in terms of use. I can stab really aggressively. I can saw and use this recurve to pull and drag through stuff and really just push when I'm cutting through that cardboard. This handle is super grippy, super secure. The way it pinches here and the whole handle fattens up while still having this curve toward the back. It is really the best of Ernest Emerson's designs, which don't look quite like anything else. They don't feel quite like anything else. There really aren't enough good things that I can say about the ergonomics of this handle. It just feels extraordinarily locked in, extraordinarily secure, and that makes the blade performance feel better. I remember one of the guys when I was getting into knife YouTube was Bearded Gear, and he would talk regularly about how the cutting performance of the knife, the perceived cutting performance, is really a combination of the blade and the handle. Because when you've got a better feeling handle, when you feel like you have more control over the blade, it feels like the knife cuts better because there's less slop. You've got more control over where that edge is, and you can push a little bit harder without knowing you're pushing harder, just because that handle feels more secure in your hand. This is really the epitome of a handle that takes very little effort to hold on to because the handle grips you back. Really, really strong handle design. And frankly, I also think it looks pretty cool as well. It looks totally distinctive. It looks like nothing else on the market. Like the CQC-15 is the CQC-15. And frankly, this mini version is, again, 3.5 inches. This is still a full-size knife, and it is much more carryable, much more general EDCable than the giant full-size CQC-15, which is really the sort of knife that I can only see people carrying if they're either a very large person or on stuff like, a job site or out camping or something like that. It's just, realistically, it's just too big for a lot of people. This is much more reasonable. And in fact, the ergonomics are even a little better. Now, that brings us to the... Actually, let me talk about one more thing. Action. So, Emerson's are on, you can sort of see them in there, these Nylotron washers, basically Teflon washers. And modern Emerson's go through the same sort of progression. You can see this one is still a little, you can hear it, a little gritty on the action on both the open and the close. It is smooth, it is consistent. The detent, so the CQC-15 used to have Emerson's double detent, where they had one detent on this side, one detent on this side. It gave a very controlled opening and closing, but it meant functionally there was almost no actual detent keeping the knife closed. Now, this is a single detent. Light detent, but with your thumb disc here, nice knurling on the thumb disc, very natural placement, flicks out very nicely. I quite like the sort of crisp action that Emerson's give you. Now this is a controlled shut action, and it's not even all that smooth. I've already tried to put some lube on this. Emerson's are still sort of a mixed bag with action. I've had some Emerson's that have progressed to have literally some of the best action I've had on a folding knife, particularly if you get the right lube in here. Some people say the Chris Reeve, their fluorinated grease works really, really well. I've tried knife pivot lube, things like that. Sometimes Emerson's will turn into these beautifully smooth drop shut actions. And sometimes they will be like this one, where even with some use, it's still kind of gritty and still kind of slow. And so that's just sort of what you get with Emerson. It's a little frustrating in 2024. It definitely feels a little retrograde. I will tell you, I find the action still relatively satisfying. It is the sort of thing you get more from kind of like a Chris Reeve action. If you think about a grittier Chris Reeve action, that's kind of what you get here. It's not a fast action, it's a controlled action, both the open and the close. It is what it is. Again, this particular one, and what I should say and what I'll conclude with is, Emerson's, even the best ones, always take time to break in. And it is quite possible, even though I've used this one a decent bit, that the action will get to that sublime character if I were to use it even more. Right now, this one is still kind of slow and gritty. It's a little frustrating, but every Emerson will require an extended break-in period, in my experience, even the best one. So that's just sort of the challenge with Emerson actions. And it's a reflection of the fact that, even though their fit and finish is a whole lot better than it used to be, it's still not at the level of fit and finish for the sake of making this knife feel premium. They no longer have the functional issues they once had with, where you would have blades that have play. There's no play here. Or you would have locks that slip. There's no lock slip here. Or you'd have G10 scales that were mismatched with the steel liners. Or, blade grinds that were just off. None of that is present. But still, they don't finish the inside of the scales. It's just sort of the machine finish there. Everything is very nice and flush, and there's a very nice chamfer all the way around the edge, but there's nothing impressive about the finishing here. The blade grinds are very nice. I love their grind lines. I love their stone wash. Their etching is very good, though it's not tactile. It's only visible. It is cool that they number everything. It's a utilitarian level of fit and finish. It sort of feels like the same kind of level as something like CQC Spyderco, where it's as good as it needs to be to do everything the knife needs to do, but no better. Now, the difference is this CQC is a $125 knife, maybe at most sort of a $140 knife. This is a $217 knife, and if you're buying anywhere in the US, you're probably paying another $20-$30 for shipping, and in many places you're paying tax on top. So this can easily be, $260 to your door. And that level of fit and finish is a little harder to swallow when you are at that higher price point. So now let's go on to the scores, and now that I look at my score and I talk through it, I'm going to modify a couple of these scores. So again, as I've said before, I score on a 10-point system. 5 are sort of your knife enthusiast characteristics. In fact, let me get my pen now. 1 second. Okay, 5 of these are sort of your knife enthusiast characteristics, your fun factor here, and 5 are your more functional characteristics related to its utilitarian performance. First, blade design. Blade design is a B. This is a very cool blade. This is also a very functional blade. In fact, this is going to be my first modification. I'm going to make it a B+. Because first off, recurve Tontos, they're a pain in the butt to sharpen, which is honestly why I had this as a B originally. But I'm kind of a sucker for recurves, even though they're a pain to sharpen. They give you such great cutting performance even as they start to dull. And you combine that with a very sharp, pointy, piercy tip like this, and it does give you a blade grind that first looks like nothing else on the market. And second, just works really well in a lot of tasks. The only thing that this blade shape struggles with is when you're trying to, again, because there's stuff in the way, or because you're trying to cut, like score something or get to one particular place. Let's say that I've got, a bunch of strings I'm trying to just like cut one. It can be hard to get to the exact point you want on this edge. So for some cuts that require a little bit more precision, this blade shape can actually be very hard to use, and I would not recommend it just because you don't have quite as much control over exactly where on that edge the thing you're cutting is going to hit. That's a function of the recurve. But honestly, given the way that Emerson tends to do their blades, with these very low saber grinds, with the relatively, honestly, 125 is thinner blade stock today. It's a very pretty blade. It's a very unique blade, and I have found it a very useful blade in practice. So that's going to call it a B+. Handle design. B+. I will talk in the feel about, again, how good the ergonomics are, and I love the overall look of this handle. Again, totally distinctive, and it looks as ergonomic as it is. I love the way they do their jimping. I particularly love the way that jimping continues from the blade down into the handle. Works really, really well. And it just looks cool. It looks nicely finished too. Reason this isn't higher, despite how much I love the ergonomics of this handle, and again, I love the distinctive look of this handle, it is still a flat G10 slab with a little chamfer here, and this aggressive peel ply texture on the top is a pain in the butt. So it's hard for me to give a handle that is so simple anything higher than a B+, just because it's a very cool design from this perspective, but they're still not going that step further to make it either more ergonomic or more interesting to look at, more stylish, anything like that. So it ends up being more getting points over on the utility side of things than on the sort of fun factor side of things. Action, I'm going to call a C+. I already talked a bit about the action. This is an action that can break in to become very nice, but out of the box it will be slow, it will be gritty. I do think the detent on most modern Emersons is pretty nice. You can slow roll it if you want to, and it will give you a nice clean break, or there's enough detent that it will fire reliably with some force. But the fact is, this is still a grittier action. This is still a sort of less smooth action, a less satisfying action for a lot of people than most of the modern knives you're used to. It's still a step behind. So that's a C+ there. Fit and finish, also a C+, related to some of the stuff we talked about just before the scoring. This is a utilitarian level of fit and finish. And I think I've scored some Emersons a little bit higher than this in the past, but this is sort of where I'm going to settle for Emersons going forward. The fact is, this is still, everything is done well. There's nothing wrong. And that's why it's a C+, not a C. But this is still a flat steel liner with no internal milling, a flat titanium liner with no internal milling, some basic jimping, basic stonewash, basic satin grind. Everything is executed well, but basic hardware here. And it's cool that everything's made in the USA, but they are still shooting for the lowest bar of complexity possible, basically, to call this a finished knife. And it is quite clearly below what anybody at this price point is delivering in 2024. If you look at what TRM is doing, yes, TRM is still making, relatively simple blades, relatively simple handles, but the level of fit and finish on the scales that you're getting with it, the level of precision on the grind, the action that you get out of those TRMs is a couple steps above what you get with something like an Emerson. ProTech much more, and I'm talking about USA makers that are in this $200-ish price range. Most ProTechs are going to feel significantly nicer. There's just that degree of fit and finish is a step above what you're going to see in an Emerson. Again, Emerson has a response to this. They make their knives to be used, not to be pretty, but that does mean that for knife enthusiasts that are looking for a knife that is fun, not just functional, they're not going to get that in an Emerson. The one thing they will get, though, is a whole lot of cool factor, which is why this is an A. First off, this is a relatively classic design. This is sort of one of the 2 or 3 Emersons that are kind of staples of the brand. Again, this Tonto recurve blade is not like much else out there. This hyper ergonomic handle is not like much else out there. It's just, and then Emersons to me are just cool. Yes, they have that whole high-speed low drag history. Yes, they have all that history with, operators and first responders of various forms, things like that, all using Emersons. Ernest Emerson is just a very cool person. There's a whole lot of brand sort of ethos surrounding Emersons, and I'm sympathetic to that, and that's why a lot of people who love Emersons, and there are a lot of people that love Emersons. It's just functionally a really tough and badass looking, really tough and utilitarian feeling knife, and frankly, from a cool factor perspective, the fact that they have kept things so simple that, this is just a obviously like huge billboardy laser mark, but gives you all that information. The fact that they're all numbered, the fact that you do have this, everything is tight and everything is finished quite deliberately, no more than they needed to get this thing out the door and functional. it almost gives a sort of mechanical, like almost industrial feel to the knife that maybe this is my engineer brain talking, but that I find very appealing. It's part of what I do like about Emerson's. I just find that this is sort of a very signature knife for Emerson, and I think that this is a knife that a lot of people will, first off, find to be very different from everything else in their collection, even if they have a bunch of other Emersons, and second, just between the history, between the uniqueness of the design, and between the deliberate choices they've made in terms of fit, finish, function like that, it does just feel very cool. So I'm going to give it an A there, which brings it to a B overall on fun factor, which feels about right. It is a very cool knife, and that coolness overcomes the fact, and it's got some pretty exceptional design on the handle and blade, and that overcomes the fact that when you look at things like action, fit, and finish, it is definitely behind the curve. Functionally, I am in fact I made both of these B minuses, and I'm going to make them both Bs now. Cutting performance is a B, and this one is tough to score. And it really comes down to, there is no task in which the cutting performance on this blade is a B. There are tasks where it's like a C+, which is basically anything where you are trying to use this part of the blade and not use the recurve and not use the tip. So I'll give an example. If you've ever bought a rolled up carpet, those rolled up carpets are often in these relatively thick plastic wrappers. And I actually handed not this CQC-15, but a previous CQC-15 I had to a friend who was cutting open one of those wrappers. And she remarked that the knife felt extremely dull. And it did have a hard time cutting through that wrapper. And that's because in that particular task, you're basically trying to score the wrapper. You're trying to drag it and just use just basically this part of the blade here to just cut through that wrapper without cutting the underlying carpet. There you're going to feel how poor the edge geometry is on this knife, especially if this, chisel edge is starting to get a little dull, and it's going to feel like it can't cut for crap. But if you're trying to pass this through cardboard, if you're trying to saw through some plant material or saw through some drywall or something like that, if you're doing anything that uses this recurve, or you're trying to stab into anything, pierce into anything, and use this Tonto, this thing is going to cut like an A-. This thing is going to cut way better than its geometry should allow it to cut. And it's because of how well designed this recurve is and how it catches that material. Again, this is surprisingly one of my favorite knives to carry in and around the garden, because for all the sorts of, usually I can get past what I'm cutting there and sort of pull the knife into it, sort of drag it in, so I'm using that recurve, and it just cuts exceptionally well, and it will cut better than knives that are way quote-unquote sharper because of that blade design. So it all averages out to a B, but it really does depend on what cutting tasks you're using it for. Utility is a B for almost the exact same reasons. This is a knife that is ergonomically fantastic across the board. We'll talk about that in feel. But when you want to pierce stuff, amazing. When you want to drag it through stuff and do pull cuts, or cuts where you are pulling the knife and using this recurve, amazing. Like literally will be one of the better knives in your entire collection for it. But if you are trying to if for anything outside of that, for anything where you either cannot pull the knife through the material or stab the knife into the material, this knife is just not going to have the cutting performance you want. And as I said earlier, you're not going to be able to place that edge on what you're cutting as easily as in a lot of other knives in your collection. It's just not as natural to know where the edge is with something as it is in something like a drop point. So this is a B in utility, largely because, much like the cutting performance, it is amazing in some tasks and terrible at some other tasks. It all averages out to a B, maybe the B minus. You know what, actually, I'm going to give it the B minus because it is frustrating how bad this can be when you can't take advantage of the recurve. Again, like that carpet thing. And I don't like a knife that is as bad at some tasks as this blade can be. And again, you have so little edge that isn't on either the Tonto or the recurve, it just gets a little tough. Feel, A minus. I think I've probably gushed enough about how good these ergonomics are. This handle design does such a good job of keeping your hand locked in place. Again, I also think it's beautiful. Like, you sort of see the ergonomics. I love the way it pinches here and then fattens and then pinches again with that curve toward the back. It's just the best of Emerson's sort of really curvy, designed for hyper ergonomics kinds of designs. There's only one grip, but that one grip is exceptional, as good as anything you're going to find on a 3.5-inch production knife. I will say, you know, the thick slab sided design is not going to be for everybody, but the benefit of having these thick slab here, big flat slab, is that this thing also does not want to rotate in your hand. Honestly, this is, frankly, no. Since I gave that, I'm going to make it an A, because I can't think of that many knives from a pure ergonomics perspective that are that much better than this handle right here. Carry, C+, very close to being a C in carry. This is a relatively thin blade relative to how thick the handle is. You know, if you compare thickness here, your Hinderer Skinny has a thicker blade and a significantly thinner handle. Again, Hinderer Skinny here. If you compare it to your PM2, thicker blade, skinnier handle. And, you know, I could compare this with just about any other knife on the market. That's part of the reason the ergonomics are so good, because these handles are thick, because you've got full G10 over unnested liners here. But you combine that with the fact that it is just a big handle. This carries very large for a 3.5-inch knife. You combine that, just because it's such a big square object, and it is so thick. It's also 4.5 ounces, which isn't light because they didn't mill these out here. And it's 4.5 ounces for a blade that is relatively thin for a 4.5 ounce knife. Again, that's about the same weight as this Hinderer Skinny, but you're getting a much more robust blade from the Hinderer Skinny than you are from the Emerson. So it's more excusable to get that 4.5 ounces here. And again, it's in a profile that fits nicer in the pocket than this does when folded up. And then on top of that, you got Emerson's notoriously pants-tearing G10 here, which is such an aggressive PO-ply texture that most people will choose to sand it down. And honestly, it's one of the biggest reasons that I don't carry this knife more than I do, because that G10 texture is so aggressive that it is legitimately challenging to carry this sometimes. It's legitimately a pain to carry this sometimes, because it will rip up your pants. Now, people all the time say, like, one of two things, which is, one, it'll soften down over time and then it's perfect. That is true, but honestly, this texture on the XM18, just as grippy as this stuff here from a functional perspective, and this does not tear up my pants. It doesn't need to be sanded down. This stuff does. Or, you know, people say you can just sand it down, but again, no other knife that I've got, no other knife company requires me to either sand down my scales or use it for a long time to get a reasonable carry experience. It just feels like it's kind of a middle finger to the customer is a little bit too strong, but it feels a little too sort of Emerson standing their ground on something they shouldn't stand their ground on, with how grippy this G10 texture is, especially when, for knives like the Roadhouse or the Appalachian, which have alternative G10 colors, they use a much larger, not as small of a pattern on their G10, and it is just as grippy but not nearly as pants destroying. That makes this feel even more like, come on, guys. So for all those reasons, C plus in carry. It still could be heavier. It still could be worse, just because this thin blade, relatively thin blade, does mean it's a relatively light blade, but it's not a good carry. And the carry is definitely a downside. And value, I'm going to call it a C plus. No, I'm going to leave it as C. $217 is not a ton. But again, because you can only buy these from Emerson, they charge shipping on all orders. And if you're in California or a few other states, you're paying tax on those. Realistically, this is about a $260 knife landed at your door. And for $260 for 154 CM, for the level of fit and finish that they have, and for the lack of ambition they have in their sort of the details, their design, their grinds, their fit and finish, all that, it definitely feels expensive. Honestly, literally, if they just made this, and again, I'm not sort of the person that usually complains about this, but if they literally just made this S35 VN, like not even I'm not asking for MagnaCut, I'm not asking for S45. I'm asking for the fact that they've used S35 in like the Hattin re-release and stuff like that. If they just start using S35 on all their knives, the value proposition would be much better. So it wouldn't be good, but this would be like a B- instead of a C. But I really like Emerson's, and even I feel like an ugh every time I buy one, just because it feels very expensive for what I'm getting. And unfortunately, you're taking a bath in the secondary market with a lot of Emerson, so you're not going to get your money back. So C in value, you are getting an exceptional design. I understand about paying for that, but they're really doing sort of the least amount of effort possible beyond that design to justify that price. And so overall, this rounds out to a B, which again feels about right. And really, the overall story of this is a knife that is extraordinary, like very surprisingly excellent at a lot of tasks, but also very surprisingly terrible at some others. So how much you enjoy this Mini 15 is really going to determine what your use cases are and whether you've got the kind of stuff that makes use of a Tonto tip and a recurve, or whether you're basically using a lot of tasks that are better suited to a traditional drop point or some more traditional blade shape. And which camp you're in is going to determine a lot of how useful this knife is for you. And so overall, it is a B. And this is a knife of significant positives and significant negatives. The places that it is good, the blade design, the handle design, the ergonomics, and the performance you can get out of this blade in circumstances is really, really good. And I still do think that Emerson's at their best are some of the most compelling knives on the market today, particularly when viewed from a utilitarian perspective. They can just get a lot of jobs done and get those jobs done really, really well. But it comes with some massive asterisks in terms of fit and finish, in terms of the usability of this blade when used outside its preferred range, and just the fact that you are paying a premium price for something that is at a meaningfully lower level of ambition in terms of production than even other knives in the price point in 2024. They're doing everything well, but even given the fact that the actions are still as inconsistent from Emerson to Emerson as I've experienced, and again I've gotten some wherever my Pancho Villa is. No, anyway. I've got a Pancho Villa that I just got from Emerson not that long ago, and the action is glorious right out of the box. It snaps open, it drops shut, it's phenomenal. Like, doesn't even require a break-in. But then I get this guy from Emerson, and it's gritty, and it's still gritty after using it for a few weeks. And so there's still those frustrations with Emerson's. And so I do think that Emerson's are unfairly maligned, and I will continue to make that case. I do not think that they are as bad as people say in terms of fit and finish. I think that this chisel edge makes a ton of sense. I love the cutting performance you can get out of this chisel edge, and I think that a lot more people should just try it than judging it on theory, because again, I could give you the theory about it. I could talk about the angle it actually gets at the edge, stuff like that. The fact is, I just know that this thing cuts and feels sharper when it is sharp than any of my V-sharpened edges, except for the ones that I put a crazy edge on. This thing can feel just stupid sharp. But there's still caveats. It's still tough to carry. It still feels very expensive for what it is, and still this weird blade shape is occasionally exceptional, but occasionally a pain in the butt. And so the CQC-15 really comes down to a knife that I think a lot of people are going to love, and a lot of people are going to hate. And I can't see anybody that is going to have a moderate opinion about this in use, except for, I guess somebody like me, which is somebody that both regularly experiences its strengths and its drawbacks. And so I shouldn't say that, because I do end up in that sort of moderate camp, which is I see all of it. And this is a knife that I want to like a lot more than I do like. It's a knife that I want to carry much more than I end up carrying it. And it's a knife that, every once in a while when I do carry it, I'll be like, wow, this thing is awesome. I want to carry it all the time. And then I'll carry it one day later and I'll use it on some other cutting task. And it's like, boy, this thing barely cuts. Or boy, this thing feels like a brick in my pocket. Like, even something like a Hinder doesn't. So it's an experience. It's an Emerson. That was a lot, but hopefully that gave you a good sense of the knife, gave you a good sense of whether this is a knife that you should give a shot or not. I would say if you see one on the secondary market and you're curious at all, give it a look. I really would love Emerson to start stepping up their steel choices more regularly, even if they were adding like $30-40 to the price. I think that would make it a better knife. I think that would make the performance much more compelling. But anyway, that's how I feel about the Emerson CQC-15. Not sure if this one is staying in the collection or not. Still TBD, because I'm going through a pretty big collection drawdown after I finish these next couple batches of reviews. Hope you found that helpful. Let me know about your experiences with the CQC-15 down in the comments below. Whether you like it, whether you hate it, any other knives you'd like me to review. And again, hope you found this either useful, entertaining, whether you had it in the background, whatever. Hope you got some value out of it. This has been Clark the Knife. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.